Let's continue reading Mein Kampf. During my last read, basically I couldn't understand what was the main thing Hitler wanted to say. He really pontificated a lot and meandered a lot. Because on one hand, he finally introduced the word Jew and he started talking about Jewish people. But however, he quickly switched topic, meander into another topic regarding a newspaper called Vienna Press, and then it seemed like it seems like he quickly forgot about the Jewish people and continue reproaching the Vienna press about their content. Then Hitler also talked about, basically he was berating Vienna press for being very sycophantic. Uh, at the same time, Hitler was angered by some of a newspaper that was very pro-France, always extolled and adulated France. He called this newspaper Gallomania, the love of France. And finally, he introduced a new person called Dr. Carl Lueger, which I don't know who is him yet. So let's continue reading and find out. But even an elementary sense of justice and forced me to change my opinion when I had the opportunity of knowing the man and his work, and slowly that opinion grew into outspoken admiration when I had better grounds for forming a judgment. Today, as well as then, I hold Dr. Karl Lueger as the most eminent type of German Burgermeister. How many prejudices were thrown over through such a change in my attitude towards the Christian socialist movement. My ideas about anti-Semitism changed also in the course of time, but that was the change which I found most difficult. It caused me a great internal conflict with myself, and it was only after a struggle between reason and sentiment that victory began to be decided in favor of the former. Two years later, sentiment rallied to the side of reasons and became a faithful guardian and counselor. At the time of this bitter struggle between calm reason and the sentiments in which I had been brought up, the lessons that I learned on the streets of Vienna rendered me invaluable assistance. A time came when I no longer passed blindly along the street of the mighty city, as I had done in the early days, but now with my eyes open not only to study the buildings but also the human beings. Once, when I passing through the inner city, I suddenly encountered a phenomenon in a long kaftan and wearing black side locks. My first thought was, is this a Jew? They certainly did not have this appearance in Linz. I watched the man stealthily and cautiously, but the longer I gazed at the strange countenance and examined it by feature, the more I questioned. The more the question shaped itself in my brain, is this a German? As was always my habit with such experiences, I turned to books for help in removing my doubts. For the first time in my life, I bought myself some anti-Semitic pamphlets for a few pence, but unfortunately they all began with the assumption that in principle the reader had at least a certain degree of information on the Jewish question or was even familiar with it. Moreover, the tone of most of these pamphlets was such that I became doubtful again, because the statements made were partly superficial and the proofs extraordinarily unscientific. For weeks and indeed for months, I returned to my old way of thinking. The subject appeared so enormous and the accusations were so far reaching that I was afraid of dealing with it unjustly, and so I became again anxious and uncertain. Naturally, I could no longer doubt that here there was not a question of Germans who happened to be of different religion, but rather that there was question of an entirely different people. For as soon as I began to investigate the matter and observe the Jews, then Vienna appeared to me in a different light. Wherever Wherever I now went, I saw Jews, and the more I saw of them, the more strikingly and clearly they stood out as a different people from other citizens, especially, especially the inner city and the district northwards from the Danube Canal, swamped with a people who, even in outer appearance, bore no similarity to the Germans. But any indecision which I may still have felt about that point was finally removed by the activities of a certain section of the Jews themselves. A great movement called Zionism arose among them. Its aim was to assert the national character of Judaism, and the movement was strongly represented in Vienna. To outward appearances, it seemed as if only one group of Jews championed this movement, while the great majority disapproved of it or even repudiated it. But an investigation of the situation showed that those outward appearances were purposely misleading. These outward appearances emerged from a mist of theories which had been produced for reasons of expediency, if not for purposes of downright deception. For that part of Jewry, which was styled liberal, did not disown the Zionists as if they were not members of their race, but rather as brother Jews who publicly professed their faith in an unpractical way, so as to create a danger for Jewry itself. Thus, there was no real rift in their internal solidarity. This fictitious conflict between the Zionists and the liberal Jews soon disgusted me. For it was false through and through and in direct contradiction to the moral dignity and immaculate character on which that race had always prided itself. Cleanliness, whether moral or of another kind, had its own peculiar meaning for these people. That they were water-shy was obvious on looking at them, and unfortunately very often also when not looking at them at all. The odor of those people in kaftans often used to make me feel ill. Beyond that, they were the unkempt clothes and the ignoble exterior. All these details were certainly not attractive, but the revolting feature was that beneath the unclean exterior, one suddenly perceived the moral mildew of the chosen race. What soon gave me cause for very serious consideration were the activities of the Jews in certain branches of life, into the mystery of which I penetrated little by little. Was there any shady undertaking, any form of foulness, especially in cultural life, in which at least one Jew did not participate? On putting the probing knife carefully to that kind of abscess, one immediately discovered, like a maggot in a putrescent body, a little Jew who was often blinded by the sudden light. In my eyes, the charge against Judaism became a grave one the moment I discovered the Jewish activities in the press, in art, in literature, and the theater. All unctuous protests were now more or less futile. One needed only to look at the posters announcing the hideous productions of the cinema and theater and study the names of the authors who were highly lauded there in order to become permanently adamant on Jewish question. Here was a pestilence, a moral pestilence with which the public was being infected. It was worse than the Black Plague of long ago. And in what mighty doses this poison was manufactured and distributed. Naturally, the lower the moral and intellectual level of such an author of artistic products, the more inexhaustible his fecundity. Sometimes it went so far that one of these fellows, acting like a sewage pump would shoot his filth directly in the face of other members of the human race. Interesting, sewage pump. Basically, it's a pump that eject urine and poo, I suppose, feces. In this connection, we must remember there is no limit to the number of such people. One ought to realize that for one Goethe, nature may bring into existence 10,000 such despoilers who act as the worst kind of carriers germ carriers in poisoning human souls. It was germ carriers in poisoning human souls. It was a terrible thought, and yet it could not be avoided, that a greater number of the Jews seemed specially destined by nature to play this shameful part. And is it for this reason that they can be called the chosen people? I began to investigate carefully the names of all the fabricators of these unclean products in public cultural life. The result of that inquiry was still more disfavorable to the attitude which I had hitherto held in regard to the Jews. Though my feelings might rebel 1,000 times, reason now had to draw its own conclusions. The fact that 9/10 of all the smarty literature, artistic tribe, and theatrical banalities had to be charged to the account of people who formed scarcely 1% of the nation. That fact could not be gainsaid. It was there and had to be admitted. Then I began to examine my favorite world press with that fact before my mind. The deeper my soundings went, the lesser grew my respect for that press which I formerly admired. Its style became still more repellent, and I was forced to reject its ideas as entirely shallow and superficial. To claim that in the presentation of facts and views its attitude was impartial seemed to me to contain more falsehood than truth. The writers were Jews. Thousands of details that I had scarcely noticed before seemed to me now to deserve attention. I began to grasp and understand things which I had formerly looked at in a different light. I saw the liberal policy of that press in another light. Its dignified tone in replying to the attacks of its adversaries and its dead silence in other cases now became clear to me as part of a cunning and despicable way of deceiving the readers. Its brilliant theatrical. Okay, I'll stop here. Basically, today, finally, Hitler talked at length about Jewish people, but I don't really quite understand was so bad about it. I have to reread, and I'll tell you in another episode. See you. Goodbye.